I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the New York Winemaker Special series. Across these 8 episodes, recorded in December 2022, we'll be exploring the New York wine scene in the company of 8 different winemakers, covering the Finger Lakes in the first 6 episodes of the series, and Long Island in the last 2. We continue the series today in the company of Bruce Murray of Boundary Breaks. We hear Bruce's origin story, and he takes us inside the early vintages at Boundary Breaks. He introduces us to the wider winemaking community, offers us a virtual tour of their property. He goes in depth on the impact of Riesling in the Finger Lakes, before discussing red grape varieties, their experience of exporting wine to Norway, and looks ahead for their impact in the UK. Enjoy.
So, Lawrence, I am a owner with my wife of a vineyard in the Finger Lakes. I am not someone who was born and bred in this area. I did grow up not too far from where we are now in the Finger Lakes. I grew up in Syracuse, which is a mid-size American city with a university, and my wife also grew up there, so we're really natives in this region. I'm in my late 60s, so I had a lot of time before this to work in conventional business occupations. I worked in the media industry, I worked in the tech industry, I worked in the software industry, and these were all things I did that most people do when they're raising kids and making their way in the world. Mm-hmm. And once you sort of reach a point in your early 50s, you think, okay, I've only got so much time left. Let's make a change and do something that I think I could do for as long as I wanted, actually. So I was living in New York City. I decided to find a piece of property here in the Finger Lakes. I was a big fan of Riesling, and my plan originally was to come up here, plant Riesling vines, make Riesling wines, sell them to a distributor, and just live a peaceful, happy life. It's happy. It's not peaceful, but it's happy. Well, so in 2007, this is now about 15 years ago, I began looking for property. It was not easy to find. I didn't know a lot about what made good vineyard property. I knew there were many vineyards in this area. This area has had a history of agriculture for 150 years. Mm-hmm. So there's a really deep reservoir of knowledge and practice and cultural life that is part of the agricultural world. Mm. But when it came to planting vines, I was really completely in the dark. I fell into a piece of property, and if you read the literature and follow the wine industry, a lot of it is about location. I think you can't fully appreciate what a difference the right location makes in making wine. But we certainly fell into a place that was really, really ideal. And that has made all the difference, quite honestly. So when I started, I still had a day job. I was in business and living in New York City. Every weekend I would come up, and I didn't really have the opportunity to serve customers or be on site. So on the weekends, from Friday night through Sunday night, I was focused almost entirely on the vineyard work. And I had two young guys, local guys that were working with me, and so I got my feet wet really the old-fashioned way, which was pruning, tying, planting, and really focusing almost exclusively on how plants are getting established here. And that's, I think you'll hear the cliche, good wine is made in the vineyard. You've heard that before. A lot of you people who are watching or listening have heard that. And, I certainly believe that's the case, because since 2011, which was our first vintage, we have worked with quite a few different winemakers. We're a little unusual in that way, in that we focus on the vineyard, and then we work with winemakers in the area, actually several different winemakers, and it's changed over the years to make our wines. And so we find that in spite of the fact that we're working with different winemakers, all of them really, really competent, the quality and the characteristics of the wine have stayed fairly consistent. So it I think illustrates how, at least in this climate, in this region, the nature of the wine really owes itself to where it's from and how it's grown and what some of the word terroir is both physical in terms of soil, climate, but it's also cultural in terms of how you actually manage the vines.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting reading through the pre-work you sent over, Bruce, and talking about those different winemakers that you've had on site. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind just, maybe taking a slightly deeper dive into perhaps one of those relationships that you think may have been, perhaps significant for a particular element of how things have developed there.
So sure, when we first started, we had a harvest in 2011 and we needed a winemaker. So we went and approached the owner of one of the other vineyards in the area. It was Scott Osborne of Fox Run Vineyard. He was the owner. His head winemaker was Peter Bell, and Peter Bell is kind of a sort of a legend in this area in that he serves as a mentor to interns and people who are making their way up in the industry as winemakers. Mm-hmm. At the time, that individual who was making his way up, his mentee, was a young man by the name of Kelby Russell. Mm-hmm. Kelby was there at Fox Run, and when we brought our fruit in, my thought was, this is my first vintage. I don't know what will come of it, but what I suggested to Peter Bell, mm-hmm. and Kelby, which is let's do several different things with this fruit. Let's see if we can, we don't have a reputation to hold to. Mm-hmm. We don't have anything mm-hmm. to uphold. So let's just see what comes of this by applying some different techniques. And I think this is very early in Kelby's winemaking days, and he did some things. He worked with some of our fruit in a way that really yielded a really unusual wine, as did Peter at the time. And so, as Kelby matured and progressed, he moved on from Fox Run. He found himself at another winery, and when we outgrew the capacity at Fox Run, we went and approached Kelby and the owner of that vineyard or winery and said, would you consider continuing to make some of our wines, which he did for many years. We then outgrew that. And so we're now with a different set of winemakers. But we really feel like the style and the characteristics of some of the wines Kelby made back way in the 2011, 12, 13, 14 vintages really stood out. And we learned a lot in that process.
Okay, and it can be relatively short, but would you mind just giving us a specific example maybe about one of those specific wines? I know it's going back a little while, but maybe just to give us a sense.
So my original aha moment in the wine industry occurred when I was at a Thai restaurant that had a very large wine list that included some wines from Germany. I picked a wine off the list, which I was not that familiar with wine in general. This is back in 03 or 04, and it was a Spätlese from the Dunhoff producer in the Nahe region of Germany. And this style of a rich, riper, lower alcohol, sweeter Riesling paired perfectly with that Thai food. So that first vintage, what I tried to do with Peter and Kelby is say, can we make that wine? How close can we come to a wine in that style? And that's where, Kelby said, well, let's try this. And it was, it wasn't the same wine, obviously, as the Dunhoff, but it certainly was a swing at that style.
Changing gears ever so slightly, another thing that really has come up in both the conversations that I've had already today have been talking about the winemaking community there in the Finger Lakes, because I think that when you travel to a wine region, you, of course, you know where you are by what you can see, and we will, get into the kind of, the virtual tour of your property really a little bit later on. But I think also it's around the people. Ultimately, a community doesn't exist without the people. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind say something about how I believe you returned to the Finger Lakes and what you've found and the way that the community has sort of evolved over that time.
So yeah, I came looking for property and met several different owners in the region. John Wagner was one. Tunker Hosmer from Hosmer Vineyards was another. I grew up actually with Tunker in Syracuse when, in the 60s. So I knew him from our childhoods, but it had been a long time. And so I think from their perspective, both of those guys have been here a long time. They really are the OGs of this region in many respects. And they've seen not many people, like me. I'm a businessman. I'm not a farmer. I was not really. You see people like me coming down the road, and you think, okay, here we go. Here's another one. How long will he last?
Yeah.
And I think both Tunker and John, were willing to assist with very specific pieces of guidance. If the point was, I said, look, I want to do this. I've got one kick at the cat here. I've got 25 years to make the best wine I can. I'm not looking to make a living. So I'm not kind of a carpetbagger. I just need to meet my expenses. I'm not awash in cash. I want to do this right. I'll do it over 25 years. What would you recommend for someone with those objectives, and how would you start? And Tunker said to me, how many acres do you want to plant? I said, well, let's start with 30. And he looked at me and he said, listen, you will not start with 30 acres of vines because that's far, far too many, and you don't know what you're doing. And so I said, okay, what's the right number? He said, well, I'd start with 5 or 6, which I did. And in fact, he was absolutely right, because that first few years I was on a pretty steep learning curve. John Wagner, I was thinking about eventually building a tasting room. I had to put the place where people could come and taste our wine somewhere. And I said, John, I'm going to tuck this little tasting room back in the woods there and out of the way so that we don't interrupt our vineyard practice. And he said, look, let's stand over here. Let's go stand over here and look out over that lake with that view. Wouldn't you want to put a tasting room here? And I thought, yeah, you're probably right about that. So it's little things like that. And, they're very generous. And what I try to do is try to reciprocate in the way that I can. And, as time has gone on, we continue to work together in a number of contexts. Tunker and several of our farms are part of an association that hires vineyard labor. So we contract jointly with people, so that we are not so big as to kind of feel like each of us is a skyscraper or an island unto ourselves. We're just not that. We're not there yet, quite honestly.
Yeah. And one of the things that I came up in previous interviews of the series is that, again, people coming in and presumably that, through your time then, as you've grown from those 5 to 6 acres and expanded and built the tasting room that I can see behind you there, then you've also become somewhat of a reference point to other people who are looking to move into this region.
Absolutely. And, I've spoken to a couple dozen, I would say, people like myself who have an interest in changing their occupation. And I try to be as candid and as transparent and as helpful as possible. And it's very different moving from one type of business into this one, because this is slow. You have to have patience. And, and it's also it's expensive, and that part of what makes it slow is you can't unless. I mean, no one really comes into this with, at least around here, with fabulous amounts of money, because if you have that kind of money, you don't do this. It's too hard. It's relentless, and it's just not the kind of thing that I think is the right fit for people who want a trophy farm somewhere. You can have a trophy farm, but the wine in this area, your wine won't be trophy wine unless you really, really dig in and decide how you're going to do it the right way.
Amazing. So yeah, I'm sure. Giving people sometimes just a truthful dose of reality can actually be helpful for them.
It is,
on.
and there's right now there's a kind of a generational shift going on in the region. When it really took off was in the late 70s and the early 80s, and so there was a contingent of people. Either they were farmers who were growing grapes for one of the big processors in the area, or they came in early in the 80s or 90s and said, this looks like an opportunity. Land was cheap. There really wasn't, the startup costs were a lot more affordable. But those folks who started in the 80s and early 90s, they're now ready to turn their businesses over, kind of hand the keys to somebody else. And often they're not children or next generation. In some cases, there is a next generation, which is great. Both in Tucker Hosmer and John Wagner's case, the next generation are really, really fine people who understand the business and have grown up in it. But in other cases, there's not that next generation. So you see some turnover coming, and that's good, I think, because not everyone thinks the same way about what grapes to pick, how to focus on either the hospitality end of your business or the winemaking end, and so it's part of the evolution of a region that, I think we're not the first to have gone through this, and you need new blood periodically.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and these are I think really fascinating kind of cultural topics that, again, people who are interested and kind of want to know. I think it's an important part of the history really of a region, and just sort of, I think it tells you a lot, because as new people come in, they will invariably have different ideas, and as you say, as the keys are handed over, then things might change, and it may be the things that we see over in the market. It might be we see a different label, but it may be that there's actually a lot more that's kind of changed in the background of that. And I think it's fascinating to get a small insight into that happening in the Finger Lakes.
Well, I've spent a lot of time listening to podcasts and people who have been in this industry, many of them in the old world, some here, mostly in California and Oregon and in the US. But what's struck me is, if you look today at well-known producers and listen to how they describe the way their region operated 30, 40, or 50 years ago, you can see that what today looks like an ideal arrangement for wines and reception around the world 30, 40 years ago was really, really different. And what I'm struck with is how, just in general, no one has had it easy. There have been periods in the certainly in Europe, during World War II, for instance, there just a lot of devastation, a lot of challenge, and so I feel like we are now, I think, in that cycle, or in that process, where there's a strong commitment to agriculture here in this region. We're not up against a big city. We're not worried about the neighbors complaining about how noisy our presses are at 11 p.m. We're not that. We are really truly still, and probably for quite some time, agriculturally focused, and that makes it interesting. I think it's not a bourgeois kind of place. It isn't.
But yeah, very very cool, very cool. I love the sort of cultural element there. Let's again change gear ever so slightly, because you already hinted at what that initial planting looked like there. Describing the woods, and I think the location of what would then go on to be your tasting room. Bring us up to 2022 in that scenario now. So, if we were to sort of plot the little Google Maps man on your property there, what would be the view that we would see around us now? I guess maybe starting with the size that you've now got, but those other elements that the lake, the tasting room, the woods. How do those sort of all fit together?
Sure. So we're located on the east side of Seneca Lake. Seneca Lake is quite deep. It's about 700 feet deep, right off the shore. We're down by the water. We're on a slope. The name Boundary Breaks is a reference to the way there are such deep gorges that were cut by glacial runoff back 10 to 12,000 years ago. So there's one of these deep gorges or breaks in the landscape at our northern boundary. There's a deep gorge at our southern boundary. That's the other break. Those are the boundary breaks. And between these two very deep gorges, we have currently about 40 acres of vines planted. These are about 60% of that. A little more than 25 acres is Riesling. About another 25% is Cabernet Franc. We think these are the two grapes that do well in this climate and actually make the most consistently high quality wines. We also grow some of the other Bordeaux varieties, a little bit of Merlot, a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon, and then some Gewürztraminer. So we were initially just going to plant grapes and not really have a public facing presence, and that was a little unconventional thinking. I mean, a lot of time and energy goes into the hospitality side of our business, and a lot of it is, seemed to me from a distance watching, buses roll up with, parties of 10, 20 people, seemed kind of a distraction. To me, at least, it seemed like that was good. That was a distraction from what we really wanted to do here, which was focus on the farming and focus on the wine. We learned before long that unless there's so many good wines in the world, there really are, that unless you give people a way to get to know you, get to know your location, get to know why your wines taste the way they do, it's hard. Why would you pick this wine over that wine off the shelf in a wine shop? And so part of what we've learned is part of what makes us function is to have a way for people to get to know us in person. And so we built this tasting room in 2016. We see about 20,000 people a year now that come through. The Finger Lakes region has become really an attractive destination for people from the New York metropolitan area, from the Philadelphia market, from Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and some of the other big areas. And that's part of that's the nature of our business, is to find a way to convey what you do to the public without letting that that tail wag the dog. I mean, it's very easy from an economic standpoint to let that tail wag the dog, and we try not to let that happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And would you say something about I guess the intersection of those two things then, in terms of the grapes that you planted and essentially the terroir and the microsite that you've started to talk about there? What have you learned over time in terms of, I guess, the location, and what are maybe some of the pressures and positives of being where you are for those grapes and how they develop through the year?
Well, my first exposure to Riesling, I mentioned, was at a restaurant, and I loved Riesling, and I assumed everybody else would love Riesling just as much as soon as they tasted it. And there's a lot, unfortunately, as good, as ideal a grape variety as the Riesling grape variety is, it's also a challenge for people because Riesling grapes are made into so many styles of wine that people really back away and say, gee, I don't know what I'm getting here. I like sweet wines, or I don't like them, or I like dry ones, or I don't like them. So I think, and this is, I'm not the only one, but by kind of sort of hitching your wagon to the Riesling grape variety, you're taking on some challenges that say you don't find with other grape varieties. So we love Riesling. We think that makes us different. We think we were probably among the very, from a regional standpoint, we're making some of the best consistently high quality Rieslings in North America. A lot of other producers in North America have moved on to other varieties that are maybe more profitable, a little easier to sell. But Riesling for us is just the one that's well suited to the climate. Now, what has happened in this region is we earned a reputation for Riesling, but we have not yet earned a reputation for equally high quality and consistent red grape variety. And so there's been a lot of experimentation. I don't know that there's a consensus yet. I think that consensus is evolving, but it's around a cooler climate red variety. Blaufränkisch or Lemberger is one that I think is certainly successful in this region. We happen to believe Cabernet Franc is actually a better fit for what we're looking for. It blends well. We like the Bordeaux style of blends. We can grow Merlot here because we're in a very warm microclimate. So we have the benefit of being able to grow Merlot successfully. We can, in certain years, we can get Cabernet Sauvignon to ripen. Not every year, but we find that Cabernet Franc dominant Bordeaux blend style red is truly a special thing for this area. That's not the consensus view yet. It may take another 10 to 15 years. There's a couple other red grape varieties I think are very promising, but in all kind of honesty, I think for a region to, in the long run, be successful commercially, to support, the kind of best practices in the vineyard and in the winemaking process, you need to settle it on one or two and just sort of be consistent across the region with those. And our vote is for Cabernet Franc.
Okay. And is that to say then that you've on site or maybe through some kind of collective agreement that there are actually different test plantings and maybe sort of micro vinifications that are going on?
Oh yeah, there are across the board. We don't all. There's a Georgian grape variety called Saperavi that just really makes a really nice wine. It's very deeply colored and it actually makes a wonderful rosé.
Very versatile. I was actually in Georgia earlier this year, and you can go right the way across the gamut, as you say. It's super versatile grape.
It really is, and it's part of the calculation, part of the thought process in evaluating a grape like that is it can do well from your cellar door, when you can explain it to people. I think it actually might be a good blending grape because of its color and how it adds some texture to a wine. If it's sitting on a shelf in, Columbus, Ohio or Austin, Texas, I think it's a hard sell. And it's a hard sell not because it doesn't taste good. It's because between us as the grower and the producer, there's a distributor, there's a distributor's representative, there's a buyer at a wine shop, and then there's a person on the floor at the wine shop or as a salesperson in a restaurant. And you've got about 5 layers of people between ourselves and the consumer, and somewhere along the way in that chain, the chain gets broken. and someone says, "What's Saperavi?" I can't pronounce it. What's Blaufränkisch? I can't pronounce it. That's just and that's the kind of thing that can be overcome with time, and it has nothing to do with the quality of the wine or the suitability of the grape variety or its origins or anything. It's simply a fact of life. And as I said, things move so slowly. You have to be careful that, and I found this when I started. We said we're only going to make Riesling. Let the world, beat a path to our door. Maybe in enough time, the world would beat a path to our door strictly because of the quality of the Rieslings we make. But you have to diversify a little bit. And so in our plantings, we have a team here. We have a small team of 8 to 10 people. We all work together. We all know we have another 15 acres to plant. And so when we sit down, the 10 of us, we have our vineyard team saying, boy, let's plant that. We have our marketing team saying, well, what about this? We have our tasting room team say, I tasted a good one of these over here. Why not try that? And I say, folks, whatever we plant, we live with forever.
Yeah.
So be mindful of when you start with something that could be a fad. I mean, we've heard of Gamay. I mean, Gamay has been very popular recently in certain segments of the New York City restaurant world. We had a distributor that said, gee, you could plant Gamay and do really well. We thought, well, maybe we could. We experimented. We tasted all that we put. We went around to try to get all the Gamays that we could get our hands on, and taste them all, and say, do we want to make a commitment to this instead of another grape variety? And in the end, we concluded, we're already working with a couple varieties that needed greater adoption in the marketplace. How many of these battles can we really win?
Yeah, super interesting, and I'm always making connections back to previous interviews, and what you've just been speaking about there is taking me back to something that a guest in the Washington State series that I put together was talking about. And you mentioned that the difference between being a winemaker and being a chef, whereas you, as a chef, you maybe over a week, you probably get to make the same dish 100 times, 150 times, tune in, get the salt, get the seasoning, and maybe even within 2 or 3 days, you've got the perfect dish, and you just don't have that same luxury, do you? I mean, you've got obviously that time period to even getting fruit in the first place, but then within that, then subsequent years, that one opportunity really every year is something that I think does need careful consideration, and it sounds as though are being respected there.
What I guess there's a certain conservatism that I found originally when it came to some of the folks here in this region. There are hybrid grapes planted in this region. Those are really hardy, very, very steady, big producing varieties that don't, they could be blended in with other grapes to make really nice wines. They don't really do that well commercially in the market on their own as hybrid varietals. But, people say, look, if you've been doing this for 20, 25, 30 years, you're going to find that there are ups and downs. There are lots of ups and downs. And today's darling grape, whether it's Gamay or whether it's, something on that order that's done well in another part of the world, if you plant it today and 7 or 8 years from now, when you actually release your first wines, the world may have moved on. Literally, the world may have moved on.
Yeah. Which I think can be interesting when you look at different, and just not saying these are exclusive, of course, but just what comes to mind when you say that, maybe grapes like Saperavi or even grapes like Zweigelt that I've come across. That I know again, you can make a variety of styles there. So maybe you might be, of course, you have to you have to plant a vine, but leaving that door open to making those different styles, and maybe it then just also reinforces the choice around Riesling, because we know just how versatile that can be as a white grape.
You mentioned Zweigelt. When I first started here back in 2008, I had been advised by someone who had really a long history in wine to say, Zweigelt, that's the one. That's the one. It makes a very nice wine. It really does. But there are other aspects of managing and maintaining a business that beyond purely wine quality.
Super interesting. And as the listeners will hear, and as I'm hearing now, that our conversation is very different to the previous two conversations that I've had of the series, and I love that, because giving every guest the room to guide and to talk about what's front of mind is really where I'm at. Just as keeping an eye on the time though, and just being aware of wanting to ask you to talk about your wine's kind of place in the world. Really, it was interesting to me that you're working with the New York Wine and Grape Foundation on promotional activities in the UK and the EU, and you also mentioned that you had sold some wines to Norway in the past. So I wonder if through either of those two lenses, that the promotional activities and the tastings, but then actually getting the wine into people's glasses and onto those lists and into people's houses, I guess, in Norway. Maybe talk a bit about what's been some of the feedback, and maybe what is that cycle of learning and adaptation look like for how these wines show up outside of the US.
Sure. So the Norway story is a good example. The state run liquor stores in Norway, as I understand it, have tasting panels, and there are importers who the tasting panel will put out a request for a certain style of wine. So back in 2018, or actually it may have been in 19, the Norwegian state liquor authority said, "Listen, we'd like to get some dry Rieslings from the Finger Lakes," and we had so we had a 17 that had been in the bottle for about 18 months, and we set that in, and it was they were tasting that wine blind, and they loved it, and so they bought a fair amount of that wine back in 2019. Then the next year on a just a purely blind basis with people that taste a whole bunch of wine with no other agenda, no one whispering in their ear, gee, Boundary Breaks is really the up and comer. They pick that wine. Next year comes, we send the 18s, they turned it down. Which says, and I think I know why. The 17, we had just a spectacular wine that year for a lot of different reasons, and the 18 was just not up to the same level, and it didn't make it through the filter there, which tells me a couple of things. One is we can make the wines that meet those high standards, and then they have high standards. They're going to turn one down if they don't think it meets that standard. So. We also realize if we follow the rule that it's hard for people truly to become engaged with our wines until they get here and see our facility. I mean, just see the location. I think we're realistic. We're only going to sell a certain amount of wine in Norway. I mean, we've had people come in and say, we're from Oslo, and we've had your wines. We love them, and we were coming to the United States, and we wanted to come to this place that made that wine. And that's obviously that's one of the more satisfying aspects of this business is when you see that. This is a slow business. We don't get any place on the table in any of these non-U.S. markets unless we start somewhere. We have to start with getting our wines out there. And if it takes 20 years, so be it. It's the nature of things, I think. And there are markets that are more receptive to our wines than others in in the EU generally.
But at the moment, the UK is still a focus. It's somewhere that you will be, and the foundation will be looking at yet again in 2023, and it's something that is still front of mind.
Sure, and I think the UK could be a really interesting market, for a lot of different reasons. It's culturally, I think, more aligned with the U.S. than maybe some of the other countries in Europe are, and also it has it understands what an emerging wine can be, and so the sparkling wines coming out of England are great, and I think we'd love to be able to kind of find ourselves on the table in the UK as often as possible.
Yeah, unbelievable. And I really, in closing, I'd just ask you to let the listeners know and let me know what would be the best place to find you online, be that website, be that social media. Where should we be looking?
So the best place to start is our website is at boundarybreaks.com. We are also pretty active on Instagram, Facebook, of course. I'm starting a Substack newsletter that really goes into how we do what we do and why we do it. So all of that is, I think, what we try to do is just give people with an interest in wine a look behind the curtains without a lot of sales nonsense. So www.boundarybreaks.com is the place to begin.
A huge thanks to today's guest, Bruce Murray of Boundary Breaks. Please do help to amplify this episode and the series by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/478. You can also find links to all episodes from the series in the show notes below. Next time on Interpreting Wine, New York Winemaker Special, in episode 479, I'll be speaking with Kelby James Russell of Red Newt Cellars. Make sure you're subscribed to Interpreting Wine podcast to be alerted when the episode goes live. See you then.